The Magnolia Diner sat on the cracked edge of Jefferson County, Mississippi, where Highway 51 bled into pine darkness and the only light for miles came from a buzzing neon coffee cup that flickered like it was trying to quit. Inside, the air hung heavy with burnt bacon grease and the low hum of a jukebox that hadn't played anything newer than 1998. At 2:17 a.m. on August 9, 2023, the place was almost empty, just two truckers nursing cold refills and Special Agent Aisha Carter wiping down Booth 7 for the fourth time that night. She moved slow on purpose. The frayed apron, the tired slump in her shoulders, the quiet, "yes sir," when customers got loud, every detail was a brick in the wall she'd built over 9 months. To them she was Keisha Mitchell, 29, single mom, late on rent, mouth just sharp enough to get her in trouble. To the FBI, she was the sharpest undercover mind they'd ever dropped into hostile territory. Her real badge lived in a hollowed-out can of Folgers back in a safe house 40 miles away. Tonight it felt farther than the moon. The bell above the door gave its tired jingle. 3 uniforms walked in like they owned gravity itself. Sergeant Malcolm Reed led the pack, 6'3", shaved head gleaming under the fluorescence, mirrored sunglasses still on even though the sun had died hours ago. Behind him, officers Dylan Hayes and Trent Pulaski, both younger, both hungry for whatever crumbs fell from Reed's table. They didn't sit. They never did. They just stood at the counter, boots planted wide, and waited for the world to remember who really ran this county. Reed's eyes found Aisha immediately. He smiled the way a wolf smiles at something already bleeding. "Keisha," he drawled, voice syrupy with menace, "you gonna pour me some coffee tonight? Or do I gotta remind you how this works?" The truckers went still. The cook, Marcus, disappeared into the back like a ghost who'd seen this play before. Aisha felt the tiny microphone taped beneath her left breast pick up the quickening of her own heart. She set the pot down, wiped her hands on the apron, and met Reed's stare. "Coffee's $2, same as always." Reed laughed once, sharp as a gunshot. "See, that's the thing. I don't pay for coffee. I protect the people who pour it." He stepped closer. The smell of his cologne mixed with gun oil made her stomach turn. "You been here, what, 8 months? You still don't understand how gratitude works." Aisha felt the weight of the .380 strapped to her ankle under the waitress skirt. Felt the panic buttons sewn into her bra strap. Felt every second of training screaming at her to de-escalate, to survive, to protect the case. She opened her mouth to give him the line that usually worked, the half apology that kept her alive, but tonight the words stuck. Because tonight Reed was drunk on something stronger than power. Tonight his hand shot out and closed around her wrist hard enough to bruise bone. "I said pour the damn coffee." The diner went dead silent except for the buzz of that dying neon cup outside. Aisha looked down at his fingers digging into her brown skin and something ancient and furious rose up in her throat. She yanked her arm back. "Get your hands off me." Reed's smile vanished. In one motion he spun her, slammed her chest first onto the counter, and the world exploded into red and blue strobes as backup cruisers screamed into the lot, lights painting the windows like blood and bruises. Cold metal bit into her wrists. Someone kicked her legs apart. The coffee pot shattered on the floor, dark liquid spreading like spilled secrets. Resisting arrest, Reed announced to no one and everyone, voice calm now, almost bored. "We got a real fighter tonight." Face pressed against the sticky formica, Aisha tasted copper and adrenaline. She could have said the code word that would bring a dozen federal agents through the door in 90 seconds. She could have ended the entire operation right there. But if she did, every recording, every marked bill, every terrified witness who'd finally started talking, all of it would die tonight. So she stayed silent. As they dragged her past the overturned stools and out into the rain, the last thing she saw through the open diner door was Marcus the cook standing frozen in the kitchen pass-through, phone in his shaking hand, mouthing a single word she couldn't hear over the sirens. "I'm sorry." Rain hammered the gravel lot in sheets, each drop stinging like buckshot against Aisha's face as Reed shoved her toward the lead cruiser. The lights kept strobing, red, blue, turning the puddles into pools of liquid fire. She stumbled when Pulaski's hand slammed between her shoulder blades, driving her forward. The cuffs were ratcheted so tight her fingers already felt thick and foreign, blood-trapped and pulsing. Reed leaned in close enough that she felt his breath on her ear. "You should have poured the coffee, Keisha." He opened the rear door himself, placed one meaty palm on the crown of her head like he was blessing her, then drove her skull into the metal frame on the way down. Pain detonated behind her eyes. She tasted blood again, warm and metallic, mixing with the rain running down her temples. The door slammed. The smell inside the cage car was old vomit and bleach. Through the mesh partition she watched Hayes slide behind the wheel, Pulaski riding shotgun, both of them grinning like kids who'd just stolen the last cookie. Reed stayed outside a moment longer, lighting a cigarette under the dripping awning, watching her through the window the way a man studies a bug pinned to cardboard. Then he flicked the cigarette into a puddle and climbed in the passenger seat of the second unit. No one read her rights. No one asked her name. The radio stayed silent. No call went out about a female in custody. Just the wet slap of wipers and the low rumble of engines as both cars pulled onto the highway, taking the back way toward the sheriff's complex, past the cotton fields that swallowed sound and moonlight alike. Aisha tested the cuffs once, just enough to feel the teeth bite deeper. She forced her breathing slow, counting heartbeats the way they taught at Quantico. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. She cataloged every second, the mile markers, the smell of wet polyester seats, the way Hayes kept glancing at her in the rearview like she might sprout fangs. 23 minutes later, the cruiser turned onto a service road she knew too well. She had driven it herself in an unmarked sedan at 3 a.m., mapping blind spots, counting cameras. Tonight the cameras were dark. Someone had killed the feed. They dragged her out beneath a single sodium light that painted everything the color of dried blood. The intake door was already open, waiting. Inside, the air was colder, thick with disinfectant and despair. A female deputy she didn't recognize stood at the sally port with a plastic bin and a smirk. "Shoes off, sweetheart. Jewelry. Everything in the bin." Aisha kicked off the worn black non-skid shoes she'd bought at Walmart 9 months ago. The concrete was ice against her soles. When the deputy reached for the simple gold chain around her neck, the one that held a tiny St. Michael medal her mother had given her the day she graduated the academy, Aisha's voice finally came out low and steady. "You might want to be careful with that." The deputy laughed, yanked it free. The clasp snapped. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled like an approaching verdict. They marched her past the drunk tank where men pressed against the bars and went quiet when they saw the look on her face. Past the property room where her apron and tip money disappeared into an evidence bag marked with today's date and a case number that didn't exist yet. Down a hallway that smelled of mildew and fear until they reached the classification cage. Reed appeared again, blocking the doorway, arms folded. "Solitary," he said, casual as ordering lunch. "Safety reasons. Girls violent." The holding cell door clanged shut behind her. 10 feet by 8, stainless toilet, thin mat on a concrete slab, no window. The overhead light buzzed like a dying insect. She stood in the center of the room in orange scrubs 2 sizes too big, wrists raw and bleeding, and listened to the sound of multiple locks engaging. Footsteps receded. Then silence so complete she could hear her own pulse. Aisha closed her eyes and pictured the evidence locker in the safe house. The body cam footage, the wire transfers, the terrified faces of witnesses who had finally trusted Keisha enough to talk. All of it balanced on the edge of a razor now. Somewhere down the corridor a man started screaming, raw and wordless. The scream cut off abruptly, like someone had stuffed a rag in his mouth. Aisha slid down the wall until she sat on the freezing floor, knees to chest, and for the first time in 9 months she let herself whisper the truth to the empty cell. They have no idea what they just started. The overhead light in Solitary never dimmed. It glared down like an interrogation lamp that had forgotten its purpose was supposed to end. Aisha had been awake for 29 hours straight when the metal food slot scraped open and a tray slid through. One rectangle of congealed oatmeal, a carton of milk 2 days past expiration, and a plastic spoon already cracked down the middle. She didn't touch it. Instead she sat on the edge of the slab, elbows on knees, staring at the tiny camera bubble in the corner. The red diode was dark. Someone had killed that too. In the world outside these walls, the absence of a blinking light would have been the first alarm. In here it was just another Tuesday. Footsteps approached, heavier than the night shift's shuffle. The slot opened again. This time a manila folder dropped onto the floor with a slap. Then the slot shut. Aisha waited until the footsteps faded before she moved. She picked up the folder, opened it under the merciless light, and felt the temperature in the cell drop another 10 degrees. Inside were booking photos taken while she was unconscious, her face swollen, lips split, eyes half-lidded like a junkie coming off a 3-day bender. Fingerprints inked in triplicate. A property receipt listing one broken necklace, $37 in tips, and a cracked iPhone 8 that had never belonged to her. And the charge sheet. Resisting arrest with violence. Assault on a peace officer, Sergeant M. Reed. Possession of a Schedule II controlled substance with intent to distribute, 28 grams. 28 grams. The exact weight of the baggie of cocaine that had magically appeared in the crumpled apron now locked in evidence. Aisha's laugh came out dry and cracked, echoing off concrete like breaking glass. They hadn't just arrested her. They had rewritten her entire existence in the space of 4 hours. She folded herself back onto the slab, pressed her spine against the wall, and started counting heartbeats again. The Bureau had a 72-hour extraction window built into every deep cover op. After 72 hours without contact, the handler assumes compromise and initiates emergency pull. Her handler was Supervisory Special Agent Daniel Rocha out of the Jackson field office. Rocha was old school, meticulous, the kind of man who still wrote case notes in perfect cursive. He would be awake right now, staring at his phone, wondering why his best agent had missed the 2 a.m. check-in. By 6 a.m. he would escalate. By noon the U.S. attorney would be involved. Except none of that was going to happen. Because the moment Reed's cruiser turned off the cameras and took the back road, the clock had stopped being a clock and started being a noose. At 7:12 a.m. the cell door opened for the first time since lock-in. 2 new deputies she didn't recognize stood silhouetted against the hallway glare. The taller one held a pair of belly chains. Mitchell, Keisha. He read from a clipboard like he was tasting something spoiled. You're up for first appearance. Judge'll be here at 9. They wrapped the chains around her waist, locked her cuffed wrists to the front plate, and shuffled her out. The hallway smelled of burnt coffee and fierce sweat. Inmates in the drunk tank pressed their faces to the bars as she passed, eyes wide, whispers following her like smoke. That's the one they say fought 3 cops. They planted that shit on her, man. I watched him do it. Aisha kept her gaze forward. Every face she passed was a potential witness, every camera another dead eye. When they reached the transport van, the morning heat was already a living thing, thick and wet and angry. The deputy shoved her up the steps. The doors slammed. The engine coughed to life. As the van rolled past the Sallyport gate, Aisha caught one glimpse of the parking lot. Reed leaning against his personal pickup, arms folded, smiling at her through the tinted window like a man who'd already won the war. The van turned onto the highway, and the jail shrank in the side mirror until it looked exactly like what it was. A concrete tomb with her name on the lid. The courtroom was little more than a converted trailer behind the jail, window unit rattling like it was dying of heatstroke. Folding tables instead of benches, a plywood dais for the judge, and a single oscillating fan that did nothing except push the smell of mildew and desperation from one side of the room to the other. Orange jumpsuit soaked with sweat, belly chains clinking with every breath, Aisha stood at the defendant's mark while a bailiff who couldn't have been older than 22 read the charges like he was ordering drive-through. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Lauren Childress, blonde ponytail, pearls that cost more than most people in this room made in a month, never once looked up from her legal pad. She didn't need to. She already knew how this script ended. Your Honor, the defendant brutally assaulted Sergeant Malcolm Reed, a 15-year veteran, causing injuries requiring medical attention. During the struggle, officers discovered 28 grams of cocaine hidden in her apron. The state views Miss Mitchell as both a danger to the community and a flight risk. We ask remand without bond. The judge, Honorable Ellis Rayburn, 71 years old, face like weathered oak, finally glanced over his bifocals. His eyes flicked to Aisha, lingered half a second on the bruises blooming across her cheekbone, then slid away like he'd seen worse and signed off on worse before breakfast. Anything from the defendant? Aisha opened her mouth. The public defender appointed 5 minutes ago, a kid who still had acne and a tie too short, started to stand, but she beat him to it. My name is Special Agent Aisha Carter, FBI badge number 3-7-9-4-1. I've been undercover in this county for 9 months investigating public corruption inside the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office. Sergeant Reed and his team are the subjects of that investigation. I demand immediate contact with the Jackson Field office. The room went so quiet the fan sounded like a helicopter. Childress didn't flinch. She simply slid a single photograph across the table, a close-up of the baggie of cocaine nestled in the pocket of a black Waitress apron. Then another photo, Aisha's booking shots, eyes glassy, pupils blown wide. "Objection, Your Honor," she said, voice honeyed and lethal. "The defendant is clearly under the influence and delusional. Probably been using her own product." Judge Rayburn didn't even let the public defender speak. He brought the gavel down once, sharp as a gunshot. Remanded without bond. Next case. They dragged her out through a side door that led straight back to the van. The chains dragged across the gravel like funeral bells. In the 2 minutes she was outside, the sun beat down so hard the asphalt shimmered. She searched every face in the parking lot, deputies smoking, clerks on their phones, looking for one flicker of recognition, one person who might still be clean. There was none. Back in solitary, the door slammed with a finality that rattled her teeth. The tray from breakfast was gone. In its place, a new manila envelope. Inside was a single Polaroid slipped under the door while she was gone. It showed her mother's house in Atlanta, small brick ranch, hydrangeas blooming by the porch, taken from the street at night. Red spray paint across the garage door in letters tall enough to read from space. "Tell them to back off or Mommy burns." On the back, written in black Sharpie. 48 hours, Agent Carter. Then we stop asking nice. Aisha sank to the floor, back against the door, and for the first time since the cuffs snapped on, real fear, cold, jagged, animal, clawed its way up her spine. Because they knew her real name. And they knew where her mother slept. The Polaroid lay face down on the concrete like a dead thing. Aisha hadn't moved in hours. Every time she blinked she saw the red paint dripping down her mother's garage door, saw the hydrangeas wilting under the glare of a gasoline fire that hadn't happened yet. The cell light buzzed overhead, relentless, turning the walls the color of old teeth. At 3:06 the food slot scraped open again. No tray this time. Just a single sheet of paper folded into a tight square. She knew better than to touch it until the footsteps were gone. When she finally unfolded it, the note was written in the same Sharpie. "Your handler's phone is off the grid. Your evidence locker in Jackson was burglarized last night. Everything's gone. You're alone." She read it 3 times, then ate the paper. Chewed it slowly, swallowed the bitter ink, felt it settle in her stomach like poison. Morning came without sunrise. The slot opened at 6:47. A new deputy, named Tape Red Crawford, slid through a breakfast tray and lingered. "Mitchell," he muttered, eyes darting down the hall, voice barely above the hum of the lights. "They're adding charges. Felony assault with a deadly weapon now. Claim you had a box cutter in your bra." He hesitated, sweat beading on his upper lip. I saw the body cam. There wasn't any box cutter." Aisha met his eyes. "Then why are you telling me this?" He looked away fast. "Because my sister's a waitress at the Magnolia. You always tipped her out of your own money when the cooks stiffed her." The slot started to close. "I'm sorry," he whispered, and then he was gone. 10 minutes later the cell door opened wide. For deputies this time, all wearing latex gloves like they were handling hazardous waste. Reed wasn't among them, but his presence filled the hallway like smoke. "Step out, inmate." They marched her past the classification cages, past the property room, into an interview room she'd never seen before. No window, no camera bubble, just a metal table bolted to the floor and 2 chairs. They sat her down, chained her ankles to the leg of the table, and left her there. 23 minutes of silence. Then the door opened and Assistant District Attorney Lauren Childress walked in carrying a thick case file and a smile sharp enough to shave with. "Miss Mitchell," she began, setting the file down like a loaded weapon. "Or should I say Agent Carter? We're past pretending now." She opened the file and fanned out photographs across the table, stills from the diner's security camera, grainy, time-stamped, showing Aisha's hand near Reed's belt during the struggle. In one frame it almost looked like she was reaching for his service weapon. "Attempted disarm of an officer," Childress said softly. "That's 20 years mandatory. Add the cocaine, the resisting, the assault. You're never seen daylight again." Aisha stared at the photos. The angle was perfect. Whoever edited them knew exactly what they were doing. Childress leaned in. "But here's the thing. Sergeant Reed is a reasonable man. Drop the fairy tale about being FBI. Plead to the original charges. 10 years, out in 7. You walk away with your life and your mother keeps breathing." She tapped the photo of the painted garage. "Or we can let a jury of Jefferson County citizens decide what happens to a drug-dealing waitress who tried to kill a cop." Aisha's voice came out raw from swallowing paper and rage. "You know I'm federal. You know this is obstruction at a level that ends careers." Childress smiled wider. "Federal agents don't disappear for 9 months with 0 check-ins. Federal agents don't get caught holding 28 grams. And federal agents definitely don't have mothers living at 2144 Cloverdale Lane with no protection detail." She stood. 48 hours is almost up, Aisha. Clock's ticking." The door closed. The chains rattled. And for the first time since the diner lights went red and blue, Aisha felt the ground shift beneath her. Because Childress wasn't guessing. She was reading from a script someone else had written. The temperature in the cell had dropped into the 50s. Someone had cranked the AC overnight just to watch her shiver in the thin scrubs. Aisha sat cross-legged on the slab, wrists raw where the cuffs had been, counting the cracks in the far wall like rosary beads. 47 hours since the diner. 47 hours since her last real breath of free air. The slot scraped open again. No note this time. Just a single Polaroid, glossy and fresh. Her mother, asleep on the living room couch in Atlanta, television flickering across her face. Timestamp in the corner, 10:47 p.m., less than half an hour ago. Someone had stood inside the house to take it. On the back, new sharp a scrawl. "Midnight tomorrow. Plead guilty or we start cutting pieces off her." Aisha turned the photo over and over in her trembling fingers until the edges cut her skin. She pictured her mother's face when the door creaked open, pictured the scream that would never make it out. Then she did something she hadn't done since she was 9 years old and her father's casket lowered into Georgia red clay. She cried. Quiet, furious, shoulder-shaking sobs that tasted like copper and surrender. At 11:47 p.m. the corridor lights snapped off without warning, plunging the block into absolute black. Emergency strips glowed faint red along the floor, the color of fresh blood under moonlight. Somewhere a gate rolled open, metal screaming on metal. Footsteps, 2 sets, moving fast and deliberate toward her cell. The door unlocked with a sound like a judge's gavel. Reed stepped inside first, silhouette massive against the red glow. Behind him, Deputy Crawford, the one who'd warned her about the box cutter, eyes wide and terrified, a black hood folded in his shaking hands. Reed didn't speak. He simply reached out, gripped Aisha by the throat, and lifted her clear off the slab until her toes barely scraped concrete. "Time's up," he whispered, breath hot against her cheek. "You're gonna sign the plea in the morning. You're gonna tell the world Keisha Mitchell is a lying junkie who tried to murder a hero cop. And then you're gonna disappear into general population where the girls owe me favors." His thumb pressed against her windpipe just hard enough to spark black stars. "Or we drive to Atlanta tonight and leave your mom in so many pieces the coroner will need a spreadsheet." He let her drop. She hit the slab hard, gasping. Crawford stepped forward, hood ready. Reed smiled in the dark. "Choice is yours, Agent Carter." The door started to close behind them, red light slicing across Reed's face like a devil mask. And then the entire jail went dark. Not the corridor lights. Everything. Every bulb, every exit sign, every camera diode, dead in the same heartbeat. A second later came the sound no one in that building ever thought they'd hear. The unmistakable, bone-deep thud of a flashbang rolling down the hallway, followed by the single most beautiful word Aisha had ever heard shouted in perfect tactical cadence. FBI. On the ground. Now. The first flashbang detonated like God slamming a door. White light punched through the gap under the cell door, followed by a concussion that punched the air from Aisha's lungs. Reed spun, hand clawing for the pistol on his hip, but the second and third bangs came in perfect overlapping thunder. The corridor became a strobe-lit nightmare, muzzle flashes, red laser dots dancing across orange scrubs, black-clad figures pouring through smoke thick as Judgment Day. FBI. Drop it. Drop it now. Reed's pistol was halfway out when 3 red dots settled on his forehead like a holy trinity. He froze. Crawford dropped the hood and threw himself flat, arms spread, sobbing into the concrete. The door exploded inward off its hinges. The first man through wore the letters FBI in bright yellow across his chest plate. Behind the ballistic mask, Supervisory Special Agent Daniel Roche's eyes found Aisha's across the chaos and held them for one heartbeat that lasted a lifetime. Agent Carter, he barked, voice muffled but unmistakable, stand by for extraction. She tried to stand, legs numb from cold and terror. Someone cut the belly chains with bolt cutters that rang like church bells. Hands, gentle now, pulled her to her feet. A medic shoved an emergency blanket around her shoulders. Through the smoke she saw Reed face down, knee in his back, wrists zip-tied so tight the plastic creaked. Crawford was already being dragged away, still crying. Roche ripped his mask off. His face was gray with exhaustion and fury. "We're late," he said, voice cracking. "I'm sorry, Aisha. Jesus Christ, I'm sorry." She couldn't speak yet. She just gripped his vest like it was the only real thing left in the world. They moved her fast. Down corridors now swarming with federal agents in full raid gear, past deputies on their knees, weapons kicked away, faces pale as ghosts. Evidence techs were already boxing hard drives, ripping open lockers, photographing every inch of Reed's kingdom before anyone could bleach it clean. In the Sally Port, floodlights turned midnight into noon. A dozen unmarked Suburbans idled, doors open. Someone had strung crime scene tape across the front gate like Christmas lights made of shame. News helicopters chopped overhead, their spotlights sweeping the yard in frantic circles. Roche guided her to the lead vehicle. Just before she climbed in, Aisha turned back. Reed was being walked out in cuffs, shirt torn, blood running from his scalp where someone had introduced him to the floor. Their eyes locked across the gravel. He smiled. Not the wolf smile from the diner. Something colder. Like a man who still had one card left to play. Roche followed her gaze. "He's done," he said quietly. "We've got everything." The safe house was a decoy. Real evidence was mirrored to a server in Quantico the whole time. "We just needed them to move on you to force the U.S. attorney's hand." Aisha stared at him. "You used me as bait." Roche's jaw flexed. "We lost your signal 48 hours ago. Someone inside the bureau killed your tracker. We had to wait until they showed their whole hand." His voice dropped. "I voted against it. For what it's worth." She climbed into the Suburban without another word. The door slammed. The convoy rolled out past the cameras, past the stunned faces of deputies who suddenly realized the rules had changed while they were asleep. Half a mile down the road, Aisha finally found her voice. "My mother." "Safe. We pulled her out 6 hours ago. She thinks she won an all-expenses-paid cruise." Roche tried for a smile that never made it. "She's pissed you didn't call on her birthday." Aisha leaned her head against the cool window and watched the jail shrink in the side mirror until it disappeared. But the cold in her bones stayed. Because Reed's last smile still burned behind her eyes. The courtroom smelled of lemon polish and old fear. Morning light slanted through high windows, catching dust motes like slow-motion shrapnel. Aisha sat in the front row wearing a navy suit that still carried the tags, hair twisted back so tight it hurt. She had not slept in the 33 days since the raid. Every night she woke reaching for cuffs that were no longer there. Reed sat at the defense table in a cheap gray suit that made him look smaller, almost ordinary. The smirk was gone. Childress sat beside him, pearls replaced by a plain gold cross, eyes fixed on the table like it might offer absolution. Judge Rayburn had recused himself the day the indictment dropped. In his place sat a federal judge from the Fifth Circuit with a reputation for handing down sentences like thunderbolts. The prosecutor, a woman Aisha had never met until yesterday, rose and clicked a remote. The screen behind her lit up with body cam footage from the Magnolia Diner the night everything broke. Not the edited stills Childress had waved around. The raw, unfiltered feed. Reed slamming Aisha's face into the counter. Hayes planting the baggie. Pulaski laughing while he tightened the cuffs until blood ran down her hands. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Someone in the back row started crying. Count 1, civil rights violation under color of law. Guilty. Count 2, conspiracy to distribute a controlled substance for purpose of framing a federal officer. Guilty. Count 3, obstruction of justice. Guilty. 27 counts in total. 27 verdicts delivered in a voice so calm it felt obscene. Then came sentencing. The judge looked at Reed for a long time, long enough for the silence to become its own punishment. Mr. Reed, you wore the uniform of a peace officer while you built a criminal enterprise that preyed on the very citizens you swore to protect. You terrorized an entire community for profit and pleasure. And when a federal agent came to hold you accountable, you attempted to bury her alive. She leaned forward. Life without parole. Every single count to run consecutively. The gavel fell like a guillotine. Reed didn't flinch. He simply turned in his chair, found Aisha across the aisle, and mouthed 2 words she read perfectly on his lips. Worth it. They dragged him out past the cameras. Childress followed 10 minutes later, own plea deal revoked, facing 20 years for her role. The courtroom emptied until only Aisha and Rosha remained. He stood beside her, hands in his pockets, staring at the empty defense table. We got 43 arrests so far, he said quietly. Sheriff resigned in handcuffs this morning. State police are tearing apart every evidence room in a 5-county radius. He hesitated. You did this, Aisha. You tore the whole thing down. She didn't answer. She was watching the spot where Reed had sat, replaying that final smile, those 2 silent words. Rosha tried again. Internal Affairs cleared you. Full commendation. They want you in D.C. next week to receive it personally from the director. Aisha finally spoke, voice raw as an open wound. They knew my mother's address, Daniel. 48 hours before you lost my signal, someone inside our own house fed them my real name, my family's location, everything. Reed smiled because he still has friends wearing the same badge I do. She turned to him then, eyes shining with something colder than tears. This isn't over. It never was. Outside, the Mississippi sun burned white against the courthouse steps. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions she didn't hear. Aisha walked through them like a ghost who had learned the taste of chains and decided the world still owed her a reckoning.